Where mercy begins with a single knock, the Wyoming wind howled like a living thing, tearing across the open plains and driving snow into the faces of anyone fool enough to be out in it. The last light of day was bleeding from the sky when a small figure appeared at the edge of Jonas Cutter's ranch, a little girl bundled in a ragged blanket, dragging something behind her that bumped and scraped over the frozen dirt. The rancher saw her first from the barn window, where he'd been oiling a lantern. He almost didn't believe his eyes. No one came this far out unless they had business, and certainly not a child, but there she was. No taller than his saddle, hair wild, face pale as the snow. Jonas stepped outside, boots crunching in the hard frost. "Hey there," he called over the wind. The girl startled, but didn't run. Instead, she straightened her shoulders like someone far older than her years and said, her voice trembling but clear, "Please, sir, Mama can't walk no more." Jonas's gaze dropped to what she'd been pulling. A crude sled made of old boards and rope. On it lay a woman, motionless but breathing, wrapped in a thin shawl. Her lips were cracked, her skin gray with exhaustion. He felt something stir in his chest, a sensation he hadn't allowed in years. Pity, or maybe something even sharper. He crouched beside the woman, pressing 2 fingers to her neck, a pulse, weak but there. Her face was kind beneath the dirt, her dark hair streaked with silver. "She your mama?" he asked softly. The girl nodded, eyes wide and bright with unshed tears. "We been walking since yesterday. The horse died. Mama said we'd find a town soon, but I couldn't see nothin'. Then I saw your smoke." Jonas looked toward his ranch house, the only light for miles. He'd lived there alone since the fever took his wife and son 5 winters back, and all that time he hadn't let a soul through his door. But now 2 strangers stood before him, a half-dead woman and a child with frost-bitten fingers. He could turn them away, tell himself it wasn't his problem. That would have been easier, safer. Yet something about that girl's voice, the quiet dignity of it, wouldn't let him. "Help me get her inside," he said gruffly. Grabbing the sled rope, the girl's relief broke through her fear. She followed him, small boots crunching alongside his heavy steps together. They hauled Martha, though he didn't know her name yet, through the yard and into the dim warmth of his cabin. The heat from the hearth hit them like mercy. Jonas laid the woman near the fire, stripping off her wet boots and wrapping her in his old buffalo coat. The girl crouched beside her mother, whispering softly, "It's warm now. Mama, we're safe." Jonas poured water into a tin cup and handed it to her. "Sip it slow," he muttered. She obeyed instantly, as though any kindness might disappear if she wasn't careful. When he asked her name, she said simply, "Annie." He nodded, lighting another lantern. "You both can stay here tonight. We'll figure something out come morning." Annie blinked up at him, as if trying to read his face to see whether he meant it. "Thank you, mister." Jonas cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Ain't nothin'." But as he watched her curl up beside her mother, small and tired and safe for the first time in days, he felt something twist deep inside. It wasn't nothing. Thought he'd buried his heart with his family, left it out there in the cold ground years ago. Yet now, with this half-frozen child breathing soft in his cabin and her mother fighting for life by his fire, Jonas Cutter felt the first spark of warmth he'd known in a long time. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, for the first time in years, there was light in the rancher's house and the faint, fragile sound of hope. The barn becomes a haven for 3 broken Salisbury morning. The storm had passed, leaving the land blanketed in a pale, untouched stillness. The world outside Jonas Cutter's cabin looked reborn white, cold, and painfully quiet. Inside, the faint crackle of the dying fire was the only sound. Martha, the woman he'd carried in from the cold, still slept, her breathing shallow but steady. Jonas had checked on her through the night, making sure the fever hadn't climbed. She looked fragile now, smaller somehow under his old quilt, but her face had softened in the warmth. The little girl, Annie was already awake, sitting cross-legged by the hearth, humming tunelessly as she tried to toast a scrap of bread on a stick when she caught Jonas watching. She gave him a quick, uncertain smile. "Morning, mister," she said. "I didn't burn it this time." Jonas grunted. "Guess not." He poured her a bit of warm milk from the stove, sliding the tin cup across the table. Annie sipped gratefully, her eyes darting to her mother. "She's gonna wake up soon," she said. "Mama always does." When I talked too much, Jonas didn't answer. He'd forgotten how talk could fill a house, how it made the silence seem less like a punishment by mid-morning. Martha stirred. Her first word was her daughter's name. Hoarse and fragile Annie was by her side in an instant, holding her hand. Jonas stood in the corner, arms crossed, unsure whether to step closer. Martha blinked up at him, confusion giving way to recognition. "You brought us in?" He nodded. "Found you near my fence. Snow would have buried you by nightfall." She tried to sit up, wincing. "We'll go soon as I can stand. I don't want to be trouble." Jonas's jaw tightened. "You'd be dead if I left you out there. Stay till you're strong enough. The barn's dry. I'll bring blankets." Something flickered in her eyes, relief mixed with pride. "Thank you, mister." "Cutter," he said. "Jonas Cutter." She gave a faint smile. "Martha Hawley." He tipped his hat out of habit. "Miss Hawley." Then they moved into the barn that afternoon. Jonas told himself it was temporary, just until she got her strength back. But even as he spread hay for bedding and hung an extra lantern on the beam, some part of him already knew better. The barn was warmer than the wind outside, and Annie made it feel alive. She swept corners with a broom twice her size, talking to the horses as though they were neighbors. "Don't mind us," she told Jonas's old mare. "Mama says we won't stay long, but I sure hope we can till the snow melts." Jonas pretended not to hear. Each evening he brought them stew or cornbread from the house. Martha always tried to pay him back, mending a torn shirt, patching a quilt, but he waved her off still. She insisted. "It's not charity if I'm helping too," she said quietly one night. Her hands working neat stitches in the firelight. He found himself watching her, the way her fingers moved, the calm in her voice. It had been years since a woman's presence filled his home, and longer still since kindness didn't feel like a wound. Annie, meanwhile, had decided the ranch was hers to explore. One morning Jonas caught her trying to pour oats for the horses when she spilled half the bag. She froze, bracing for his anger, but he just sighed. "Next time. Hold the scoop steady," he said, showing her how. Her grin came quick and bright. "You sound like my papa used to." The word struck him deep. Though he didn't show it, days slipped into weeks. The snow outside piled higher, but inside the Cutter ranch, something was thawing. The woman who'd been half dead now stood straighter, color returning to her cheeks. The girl laughed louder, and Jonas hard. Quiet Jonas found himself listening for that laughter, waiting for it without realizing why. He told himself it was only for the sake of company, the comfort of a human voice. But when he caught Martha looking at him across the supper table, her smile small and knowing, he understood the truth. The silence he'd once lived by was no longer enough, and he wasn't sure whether that frightened him or saved him. The truth of how they came to him and what they're running from. The thaw came slowly that year, the kind that teased the earth with false hope. Patches of brown showed through the snowdrifts, and the river began to whisper under its crust of ice. But in the quiet valley of Jonas Cutter's ranch, winter still lingered in the land, in the house, and in the hearts trying to heal inside it. It had been nearly a month since Martha Hawley and her daughter arrived. The barn had turned into something between a refuge and a memory warm, lived in, smelling of hay and wood smoke. Jonas still pretended they were guests, though by now Annie had a routine as steady as any hired hand. She fed chickens at dawn, brushed the horses before breakfast, and sat on the fence each afternoon humming songs she half remembered from before Martha. Her strength returning, helped wherever she could. She cooked simple meals, darned Jonas's old shirts, and spoke in the calm, measured tones of a woman who'd seen too much to waste words, yet there were shadows in her eyes, the kind that didn't come from the cold. Jonas noticed them. Though he said nothing, he wasn't one to pry, but he'd learned long ago that silence could hold more truth than questions ever did. That night, after supper, the storm clouds rolled in again. Low and heavy, Jonas threw another log on the fire and found Martha sitting near the window. Her hands clasped tight. Annie was asleep on the rug, one arm curled around a wooden horse Jonas had carved her. "You're thinking loud," he said quietly. She gave a faint smile. "That obvious?" "Only to someone who's done their share." Martha hesitated, then looked toward the flames. "You deserve to know what kind of trouble you've taken in." Jonas leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking. "Ain't my habit to ask, but I won't stop you if you need to talk." For a moment, only the fire spoke. Then she began. They'd left Missouri the spring before, traveling west with a wagon train. Her husband, Eli Hawley, had been a trader, good man, strong, but too trusting. When rumors spread that bandits were following them, Eli insisted on staying with the others, protecting families that couldn't fight. The ambush came 2 days later. Martha's voice trembled as she spoke, her fingers twisting in her lap. She told him how the bandits came at dawn, guns blazing, how the wagons scattered in panic. Eli had tried to draw fire away from the women and children. When the smoke cleared, he was gone. So were half the travelers. She and Annie hid in the hills for days before finding the road again. Every mile westward had been a prayer and a punishment. "I thought if I kept walking, maybe God would give us a place to stop," she whispered. "When I saw your fence that night, I thought maybe that was the end of the road." Jonas stared into the fire, jaw tight. He didn't trust his voice. His own ghost stirred, the wife who died birthing their son. The fever that took the boy before he'd learned to ride. Recognized loss finally. He said, "Ain't no shame in surviving. You did what you had to." Her eyes lifted to his, shining in the firelight. "It doesn't feel like surviving, Mr. Cutter. It feels like borrowing time that wasn't meant for me." Jonas looked at her a long moment, then said quietly, "Then maybe it's time you started living it instead." Something shifted then, a silence that wasn't empty anymore. Martha's shoulders eased, and for the first time since she'd come, she didn't look like a woman waiting to leave. Later that night, as the wind picked up outside, Jonas stood in the doorway and watched her cover Annie with a blanket. The girl murmured in her sleep, reaching for her mother's hand. Martha looked up, catching Jonas's gaze. No words passed between them, but the understanding was there, deep and quiet as the roots beneath the frozen soil. Had told himself they were just passing through. But now, he knew better. He would protect them, not because he had to, but because somewhere between their sorrow and his silence, they had begun to fill the empty spaces he'd thought would never heal. And for the first time in years, Jonas Cutter made a promise, not out loud, not even to them, but to himself. He wouldn't let the world take anything more from that little girl or her mother, not while he still drew breath. Here the land begins to bloom again, and so did their hearts by the time the thaw came for good. Cutter Ranch had changed. The snow melted into the thirsty soil. The river ran fast and silver again, and patches of green pushed through the brown, stubborn earth. For the first time in years, Jonas Cutter felt the season turning, not just in the land, but in himself. Martha and Annie had been there through the long winter, and somehow it no longer felt like they were guests. Their presence had woven itself into the rhythm of the place, softening the edges of its loneliness. The house that once echoed with silence now hummed with the sounds of life, a kettle whistling, laughter from the yard, the shuffle of small boots on wooden floors every morning. Martha opened the door to let in the crisp air. She'd stand there for a moment, breathing deep, the sun catching her hair as she looked toward the horizon. It was a simple thing, but it filled Jonas with something warm and unfamiliar. He had forgotten what Grace looked like until he saw it in her quiet. Steady, alive Annie, meanwhile, had claimed the ranch as her own kingdom. She followed Jonas from dawn to dusk, trailing behind him like a shadow in a tattered dress. When he fed the cattle, she was there. When he mended fences, she carried mails, and when he saddled his horse, she begged to ride at first. He refused. "You're too small," he'd said, "and your mamma'd have my hide if you fell." But Annie was relentless one afternoon. While the sun spilled gold over the valley, he finally lifted her onto the saddle. "Hold tight," he warned. "I ain't scared," she grinned. Clutching the horn like a warrior, he led the horse slow around the pen. And her laughter rose bright and pure into the open air. It startled something loose in him, something he hadn't let himself feel since before the fever took his boy. When he glanced toward the house, Martha stood on the porch, one hand pressed to her mouth, smiling through tears that night. After Annie fell asleep by the fire, Martha lingered in the kitchen, drying dishes. Jonas leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "She's a handful," he said softly. "She's alive," Martha replied, setting a plate aside. "That's more than I dared hope for." Their eyes met. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was full, warm, alive. "You've done a lot for us, Mr. Cutter," she said after a pause. "More than you had to." Jonas shrugged, his voice rough. "Don't reckon it's about what I had to. Feels like maybe it's what I was meant to." The words surprised him as much as her, but they hung there in the lamplight, honest and unguarded. In the weeks that followed, the ranch came back to life. Jonas and Martha worked side by side, planting the spring garden, mending fences, fixing what the winter had broken. It was hard work, but it carried a quiet joy. Martha hummed while she worked, and sometimes Jonas found himself joining in without realizing. They planted a young apple sapling near the porch. "Annie's idea. So we'll have something pretty come next spring," she said together. They dug the hole, set the roots, and packed the dirt around it. Martha's hand brushed Jonas's as they worked, and for a moment neither pulled away. "Guess we'll see if it takes," Jonas said. "Straightening up it will," Martha answered with quiet certainty. "Everything deserves a chance to grow." Jonas looked at her then. Really looked. The strength in her eyes, the peace in her smile, and something deep inside him yielded that evening, when the sun sank behind the hills and painted the sky in fire and gold. Jonas stood at the fence watching the two figures by the house, Martha hanging laundry, Annie chasing a dog through the tindadina. Grass. The ache that rose in him wasn't pain this time. It was something gentler, something that made him believe maybe God hadn't turned his back after all. He had opened his door to a broken woman and her child somewhere along the way. They had opened his heart, and for the first time in a long while, Jonas Cutter dared to hope that this fragile, ordinary peace might just last. When the past comes knocking, the heart must choose. Spring had settled across the valley like a promise. The land bloomed green and gold. Calves bawled in the pasture, and Cutter Ranch breathed easier than it had in years. Jonas had begun to believe that maybe the worst was behind them. Martha's laughter filled the air now, soft and low, and Annie's chatter followed him everywhere he went. For a man who'd once spoken to no one but his horse, it felt almost like a miracle. But peace on the frontier was always borrowed time, and Jonas knew that too well. It began with the dust trail he spotted it from the ridge while checking fence lines. A single rider coming up the valley road. Nothing unusual about that, except for the way the man rode, slow, deliberate, scanning the land like a hunter. Jonas narrowed his eyes. No neighbor came from that direction, and no peddler rode alone this far out. By the time he reached the yard, Martha was hanging laundry by the porch. "Got company comin'," he said, unsaddling his horse. "Best take Annie inside for now." She looked toward the horizon, and her face went pale. Jonas noticed it instantly. "You know him?" he asked. Her hands gripped the clothespin so tight her knuckles went white. "If it's who I think it is, yes." The writer arrived just after noon. A broad man with a scar down his cheek and a smile that never reached his eyes. His coat was too fine for the trail, his boots too polished for honest work. He tipped his hat. "Looking from Jonas to the house, afternoon," he drawled. "Name's Roy Larkin. I'm looking for a woman and a child. Been traveling west. Heard they might have passed through here." Jonas's jaw tightened. "Lots of folks pass through." "Not these two." Larkin dismounted, dusting his gloves. "The woman's name's Martha Hawley. She was with a wagon party that got attacked last fall. Rumor says she might know something about it, maybe even had a hand in it." Martha appeared in the doorway then, pale but steady. "That's a lie," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. Larkin's smile turned thin. "Ain't that convenient? The only survivor saying she's innocent." He looked her over. "Slow and cruel. Your husband died in that ambush, didn't he? Shame how quick folks turn when money's involved. There's a reward out east, alive or dead." Jonas stepped forward before he realized he'd moved. "You best leave now." Mr. Larkin chuckled. "Didn't mean no offense, just doing my job. Maybe I'll come back after supper. Once we've all had time to think." Jonas's eyes were hard as iron. "You come back. You won't leave the same way." Larkin met his stare, then spat in the dirt. "Didn't figure the great." Jonas Cutter would take in a bandit's widow. He mounted his horse and rode off, but not before glancing back, his meaning clear. He'd return that evening. The ranch felt different. The soft peace of the past months had shattered, leaving a heavy silence in its place. Annie sensed it too. She sat on the stairs, clutching her wooden horse, eyes wide. Martha sank into a chair by the hearth, her hands trembling. "He's telling the truth about the reward," she whispered, "but it's a lie about the rest, I swear it." "Jonas, I didn't do anything." Jonas knelt beside her, his voice steady. "You don't owe me explanations. I know who you are, and I won't let that man touch you or your girl." Her eyes filled with tears. "You'd fight for us? After everything you've lost?" He reached for her hand, rough and warm against his. "I already did once, and I'd do it again." Later that night, Jonas loaded his rifle and sat by the window. The lantern turned low. The sound of the wind outside was sharp. Restless Martha sat by the fire, silent, while Annie slept in her lap in the dim light. She looked over at him, this man who had once sworn never to care again, and saw something unyielding in his eyes. Larkin might return with lies and bullets, but Jonas Cutter was no longer a man waiting to die. He was a man who'd found something worth protecting, and before the night was through, the whole valley would know it. Peace at last, and a home built not of blood, but grace. The storm broke just before dawn, not a storm of rain this time, but of men and noise and gunfire that tore through the quiet valley like thunder. By sunrise, it was over. The land was still again, washed clean by silence, and the Cutter ranch, though shaken, still stood. Jonas Cutter had kept his promise. Roy Larkin came back under moonlight, just as Jonas had known he would. 2 other men rode with him, hired guns, rough and greedy looking. They tied their horses by the corral, thinking the house asleep, but Jonas was waiting. He stepped from the shadows, rifle steady in his hands, voice low and even. "You get one chance to ride out of here." Larkin smirked. "You don't scare me." "Cutter, ain't no law says she ain't mine to take. That woman's got a price on her head, and I aim to collect." Martha had come to the door, holding Annie tight. The lamplight framed them in gold, and something about the sight of them, the woman and the child who'd brought life back into this broken home, lit a fire in Jonas's chest that no storm could put out. He moved first. What followed was quick, fierce, and inevitable. A warning shot cracked through the night. Larkin's men dove for cover behind the fence. Firing back, sparks flew from the barn door as bullets struck wood. Jonas returned fire with calm precision, every movement deliberate, honed from years of ranch work and grief. Then, suddenly, silence. One of the hired men lay wounded. Another fled into the dark. Larkin stood near the gate, his gun shaking, his face twisted in rage. "You think you can keep him?" He spat. "They'll only bring you pain." Jonas took a step forward, rifle lowered now. "They already brought me back to life," Larkin fired wildly. But the shot went wide, and Jonas didn't miss when it was over. The night wind carried away the smoke, and the first pale streaks of dawn touched the horizon. Larkin's horse bolted down the valley, and what was left of his greed went with it by morning. The world looked different. The sky stretched clean and blue above the ranch, the snowmelt shining like silver ribbons across the grass. The danger had passed, but something deeper had changed too. Jonas sat on the porch steps, hat in hand, watching the sunrise. His knuckles were raw, his heart heavy, not from regret but from the strange, quiet knowledge that life would never be the same again. Martha stepped out beside him, a blanket around her shoulders, her face pale but strong. "You didn't have to fight for us," she said softly. "Yes, I did." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't from fear. "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't," he said, his voice rough. "Just stay." Annie came running from the barn, her small boots splashing in the puddles. "Mama." "Mr. Cutter," she called, holding up something bright. "Look, the apple tree's got buds." They both turned, and there, near the porch, the little sapling they'd planted weeks ago had tiny green leaves unfurling in the morning light. Martha smiled, wonder softening every line of her face. "Guess it took after us," she whispered. Jonas chuckled, the sound low and warm. "Took a bit of fight, but it's standin'." That evening, after chores were done and the valley glowed beneath the sunset, Jonas built a new fence around the garden. Wider this time. He told himself it was for the crops. But Martha knew better. He was making space for a family. When he came inside, Annie was asleep by the fire again, her little hand curled around his old dog's paw. Martha looked up from her sewing, her smile tired but real. Jonas hesitated, then sat beside her. The words came slow but sure. "You don't have to keep saying. You'll leave when you're ready." She turned to him, eyes shining. "I wasn't planning to." He reached for her hand, and for the first time in years, the ache in his chest wasn't from loss. It was from something alive, something hopeful. Outside, the apple sapling swayed gently in the breeze, its roots finding strength in the same soil where so much pain had once been buried. And inside the small house, warmed by firelight and laughter, Jonas Cutter finally felt the one thing he'd thought the world had taken from him forever: home.